Hey everyone, welcome to our deep dive on generative AI and sustainability. It's really amazing to see how fast this technology is growing. Kind of even blows my mind sometimes. But with all this excitement, it's super important that we also think about, the planet. We've got to consider what this all means for the environment. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to be looking at the emissions impact of generative AI. Is it going to make climate change worse, or can it actually help us fight it? And I think you'll find some of what we've learned really surprising. Like, did you know that using Gen AI every day in businesses could actually have a bigger impact on emissions than the energy it takes to train those massive language models in the first place? To help us unpack all of this, I've got a real expert with us. They're amazing at connecting all the dots and giving us a clear picture of this really complex issue.
Thanks. It's definitely a fascinating area with a lot of potential, but also some challenges.
Absolutely. So, one thing that really stood out to me was this research from PwC. They did this deep dive into the emissions impact of generative AI. It's pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, their study was really thorough.
They didn't just look at the energy needed to train these large language models. They also factored in the energy used to customize models with, specific company data. And maybe most importantly, they looked at the energy used every single day when these models are used for tasks like, writing text or generating code, which they call model inferencing. That's a mouthful.
It is, but it's important. They basically look at the whole life cycle of a generative AI model, from building it and training it with all that initial data to customizing it with the company's own data, and then finally to how it's actually used day to day in business. This big picture approach gives us a much clearer picture of the overall environmental impact.
And get this, the study found that the biggest contributor to emissions isn't actually the initial training of the model, it's the ongoing use by businesses. Like even PwC themselves admitted that their own daily use of these models was contributing the most to emissions. It's like, think about building a car.
Yeah.
There's energy that goes into making it, but then you have to think about all the energy used to drive it every day for years and years.
Exactly. And that daily use really adds up. While training a large language model takes a lot of energy, it's just a one-time thing. But when you have millions of people using these models every day for all sorts of tasks, all that energy consumption from those interactions really starts to add up. PwC actually found that model inferencing accounted for more than 90% of the emissions from their generative AI use.
90%. Wow, that's huge. It really makes you think about the whole picture, doesn't it? I mean, businesses are already using generative AI to change how they work in tons of ways. Can you give us some examples and maybe talk about how those different applications might impact emissions differently?
Sure. So generative AI is being used for a lot of things. Things like automating tasks, creating content, helping with coding, and even, analyzing data to help companies become more sustainable themselves. For instance, PwC is using it to analyze tons of data from building sensors, and that helps them optimize energy consumption and lower their carbon footprint. But the impact of these applications on emissions really depends on a few factors: the complexity of the task, the amount of data being processed, how efficient the AI model itself is, and how often it's being used.
So it's not like a simple yes or no answer when it comes to whether generative AI is good or bad for the environment. It sounds like it really depends on how these models are designed and what they're being used for. But what about the technology itself? We're seeing new models come out that are more compact and efficient. Could those help reduce emissions even if more people are using them?
Yeah, that's a really important area of development right now. Researchers are working on making these models more computationally efficient, which basically means they need less processing power and therefore less energy. For example, there's been a lot of focus on developing these things called sparse models. And these models only activate certain parts of the neural network depending on the task at hand, which can really reduce the computational load and how much energy they use.
So it's kind of like having a car with a more fuel-efficient engine. It can help, but you still have to be careful about how much you're driving. So it's about striking a balance between better technology and using it responsibly. Generative AI isn't just developing on its own. It's part of this whole ecosystem of technologies.
Mhm.
Things like specialized processors, cloud computing, and maybe even quantum computing one day. And all of those are becoming more energy efficient too. So could those advancements help offset some of the emissions from generative AI?
Definitely. We're seeing a convergence of all these technologies,
Oh,
and
yeah.
that could lead to a more sustainable future for AI. For instance, you've got these specialized processors like Google's TPUs and NVIDIA's GPUs. They're designed to handle the complex calculations that AI models need, and they do it way more efficiently than traditional CPUs, so they can do the same work using less energy.
It's like using the right tool for the job.
Yeah.
You could use a hammer to drive a screw, but a screwdriver is going to do it way better.
Exactly. And then you have cloud computing platforms. Those let companies share computing power, so they don't all have to build and maintain their own data centers, which can be really energy intensive.
So it's about optimizing the whole infrastructure,
Hmm.
from the chips to the cloud. And what about quantum computing? I know it's still pretty early, but could it change how we train and run these AI models in a way that uses less energy?
Yeah, quantum computing definitely has a ton of potential. It could revolutionize fields like drug discovery, materials science, and yeah, even AI. Quantum computers basically use the principles of quantum mechanics to do calculations in ways that normal computers just can't. And that could lead to some major breakthroughs in AI, potentially making it possible to train and run models way more efficiently than we can today.
That's pretty amazing to think about. But for now, let's focus on what we can do right now to make sure we're using generative AI responsibly and in a way that's good for the planet. The PwC report had some really good advice on this. They outlined 3 key steps that businesses and individuals can take to minimize their environmental impact. So what are those steps?
The first one is all about measuring. So when you're thinking about starting a project that uses generative AI, you need to try to figure out what its potential impact on emissions will be. And luckily, there are more and more tools and methods being developed to help with that assessment.
So basically, we need to be thinking about the environmental impact from the very beginning. It's not just about asking, can we do this? It's also about asking, should we do this? And if so, how can we do it in the most sustainable way?
You got it. The second step is to think holistically. Don't just look at the emissions from using the model. You need to also consider the energy it took to build it, customize it, and maintain it. Thinking about the entire life cycle like that will help you make smarter choices about which models to use and how to use them efficiently.
It's like thinking about the environmental impact of a product. You have to consider everything from the raw materials to what happens to it at the end of its life. It's about understanding the whole picture.
Exactly. And then the final step is to look for convergence. Keep an eye on how generative AI is developing alongside all these other technologies like specialized processors and quantum computing. Those advancements might give us even more ways to reduce the environmental impact of AI in the future.
So it's like realizing that generative AI isn't just this isolated thing. It's part of this whole tech world that's constantly changing. And the way these different technologies work together could lead to even more sustainable solutions.
Precisely. By staying informed and taking a holistic approach, we can use the power of generative AI while also minimizing its impact on the environment.
This has been super insightful, and I think it gives us a really good framework for how to navigate this new world in a responsible way. But before we wrap things up, I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about how generative AI can actually help us with sustainability efforts. We touched on this earlier, but I'd love to dive deeper into some specific examples of how this technology is being used to combat climate change.
There are some really cool applications emerging. For example, generative AI is being used to optimize renewable energy systems. It can analyze weather patterns, energy demand, and grid capacity. And that helps make solar and wind power more efficient and reliable.
So it's about using AI to make renewable energy sources more predictable and reliable, which is really important if we want more people to use them.
Exactly. Generative AI is also being used to develop new materials for carbon capture and storage. Researchers are using AI models to simulate and design materials that are better at capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that could lead to much more effective technologies for fighting climate change.
It's amazing how AI can speed up the development of these important technologies. It's like having a super smart research assistant that can analyze tons of data and come up with innovative solutions.
And it goes beyond just material science. Generative AI is also being used in climate modeling. It's helping scientists create more accurate and complex models to predict what will happen with the climate in the future. And that information is vital for developing effective strategies to adapt to and mitigate climate change.
It seems like generative AI is becoming a crucial tool in our fight against the climate crisis. It's not just about reducing the environmental impact of the technology itself, it's also about using its power to come up with solutions to the very problems we're facing as a planet.
Yeah, that's the exciting potential of generative AI. It's a tool that can help us build a more sustainable future. But as we've been talking about, it's really important to use it responsibly, thoughtfully, and with the good understanding of its potential impact on the environment.
That's such a key point. We have this incredibly powerful technology. But with that power comes a responsibility to use it wisely. We need to ask ourselves not just what we can do with generative AI, but what we should do.
I totally agree. It's a call to action for all of us to be informed, engaged, and responsible with this technology.
And on that note, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll recap everything we've learned today, and we'll give you some resources so you can keep learning more about this fascinating topic.
Yeah, it's really about finding the most efficient way to get things done.
Right. So it sounds like we need to be thinking about optimizing everything, from the tiny chips in these machines to the huge cloud networks they rely on. Okay, but what about quantum computing? I know it's still early days, but could it totally change how we train and use these AI models,
Yeah.
maybe in a way that uses a lot less energy?
It's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
Quantum computing has the potential to be a real game changer, not just for AI, but for all sorts of fields like, drug discovery and material science. Quantum computers work in a totally different way than regular computers. They use quantum mechanics to do calculations that are just impossible for our current computers to handle.
Yeah.
And that could lead to huge breakthroughs in AI. We might be able to train and run these models way more efficiently than we can now.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing. But let's bring it back down to earth for a second. What can we do right now to make sure we're using generative AI in a way that's good for the planet? I remember the PwC report had some practical advice on this. They talked about 3 key steps that businesses and individuals can take.
Yeah, they did. The first step is all about measurement. Before you jump into a project that uses generative AI, it's important to try and figure out what the impact on emissions will be. And the good news is there are more and more tools and methods being developed to help us do that.
So it's about making sure we're considering the environmental impact right from the start.
Right. It's not just about can we do this, it's also about should we do this? And if so, how can we do it in the most sustainable way possible?
I like that. So what's the second step?
The second step is to think holistically. It's not enough to just look at the emissions from using the model itself.
Yeah.
You have to factor in the energy that was used to build it, to customize it, and to keep it running. When you look at the whole life cycle like that, you can make much more informed choices about which models to use and how to use them efficiently.
That makes sense. It's like with any product, really. You have to think about the impact from the very beginning to the very end.
Exactly.
Okay, so what's the third step?
The third step is to keep an eye on convergence. Generative AI isn't developing in a vacuum. It's part of this whole ecosystem of new technologies, like those specialized processors we talked about and quantum computing. And as these technologies evolve, they might offer new ways to reduce the environmental impact of AI.
Right, so we need to be aware of what's happening in the bigger picture and look for opportunities to use these technologies in a way that benefits both us and the planet.
Precisely. It's all about staying informed and taking a holistic approach.
This has been incredibly helpful. It feels like we've gotten a much better understanding of how to use this powerful technology in a responsible way. But I want to shift gears for a bit and talk about how generative AI can actually help us with sustainability. I know we touched on this earlier, but I'd love to dive into some specific examples. How is this technology being used to fight climate change right now?
Well, one really exciting area is renewable energy. Generative AI is being used to make things like solar and wind power more efficient and reliable. It can analyze things like weather patterns, energy demand, and grid capacity, and that helps make sure we're getting the most out of these renewable sources.
So it's about making renewable energy more predictable, which is really important if we want it to be a viable alternative to fossil fuels.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
What else?
Another really promising application is in material science. Researchers are using generative AI to develop new materials that are better at capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This could be huge for carbon capture and storage technologies.
It's like AI is helping us come up with new tools to fight climate change.
Exactly. And it can also help us use our existing tools more effectively. For example, generative AI is being used to improve climate modeling. Scientists are using it to create more accurate and complex models that can predict future climate scenarios. And that information is crucial for developing effective strategies to adapt to and mitigate climate change. It sounds like generative AI is becoming essential in the fight against climate change. It's not just about minimizing the environmental impact of the technology itself. It's about using it to develop solutions to the biggest environmental challenge we face.
I think that's a great way to put it.
So it's not about being afraid of this technology. It's about understanding its potential, both the risks and the rewards, and then using it in a way that benefits both humanity and the planet.
Couldn't said it better myself.
This has been a really fascinating discussion, and I think the key takeaway from me is that generative AI is a powerful tool, but it's up to us to use it wisely. we need to think about the environmental impact of our choices, and we need to be constantly looking for ways to use this technology for good.
Absolutely. It's a call to action for all of us to be informed, engaged, and responsible.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. All right, so let's do a quick recap of what we've learned today about generative AI and sustainability.
Sounds good.
So first, we talked about that PwC research, the one that showed that just using generative AI every day in business, actually has a bigger carbon footprint than the initial training of those models.
Right. The day-to-day use is what really adds up.
Exactly. And then we got into how the technology itself is changing, like how there are these new models that are way more efficient and use less energy. And we also talked about how all these other technologies like specialized processors and cloud computing could help offset some of those emissions concerns.
Yeah, that convergence of technologies is really exciting.
It is. But of course, technology alone isn't the whole story. We also need to use it responsibly. Remember those 3 steps from PwC. Measure, think holistically, and look for convergence.
Yeah, those are good guidelines for anyone using this technology.
Totally. But then we also talked about how generative AI can actually be used to help with sustainability, like how it's being used to make renewable energy more reliable and to develop new materials for carbon capture.
It's pretty amazing how AI can help us tackle these huge challenges.
Right. And I think that brings us to the main point of our conversation today. Generative AI is a really powerful tool. It can impact the environment in both positive and negative ways. So it's not about being scared of it. It's about understanding how it works and using it responsibly, and always asking ourselves how we can use it to make the world a better place.
I think that's a great takeaway.
So what are your final thoughts on all of this?
I think we're just at the beginning of understanding how generative AI will shape our world. And it's up to all of us to make sure we're using it for good. We need to be informed, engaged, and proactive in shaping this technology and its impact on the planet.
Couldn't agree more. Well, that's about all the time we have for today, but we've only scratched the surface of this topic. There's so much more to explore and discuss, so I encourage everyone listening to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a more sustainable future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.